This conference will now be recorded.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the ICG's Digital Academy webinar series. I'm Sally Alsop, the ICG committee member responsible for running our webinar programme. For today's webinar, we're delighted to welcome Dr. Toby Green, Director and co-founder of MyCarbon, and Dr. John Whittle, who's Director of Operations and Strategy. Toby co-founded MyCarbon whilst conducting his PhD at the University of Leeds in bioenergy in 2016. With expertise in carbon quantification, emission reduction strategies and carbon offsetting, it's his life's mission to reduce the impact of the climate crisis on the world. Drawing on his social scientist background, John has advised some of the biggest brands and businesses in the world on how to understand and manage their global and social impact, both in terms of their environmental footprint and how they successfully engage with their customers and audiences. During this webinar, MyCarbon will describe the real impact micro-businesses have on the environment, provide some potential reduction strategies in research projects, explain the future of sustainability and how it will affect your work, and provide some tips on what you need to do to gain a competitive edge. Toby and John are happy to take questions at the end, so please type your questions in the chat box as we go along, and I'll read them out at the end, or simply turn on your webcam and raise your hand if you would like to ask your question yourself. We're really grateful to Podengo for sponsoring this webinar. Podengo is a doggedly determined recruitment agency founded by a qualitative researcher for fellow researchers. They aim to source the best, not just the right participants, for a range of research projects. Before I hand over to Toby and John, here's a reminder about the ICG's festive lunch on the 1st of December. If you haven't booked your place on that, then do go ahead. And also we have our last webinar for the year will be one on cybersecurity, so one to definitely to sign up for. And we'll be producing a timetable of webinars for the new year very shortly. Don't forget that we're able to offer great value sponsorship opportunities with each of our webinars. Sponsorship normally costs £120 for a lot of exposure on our website, mailers and social media, and of course on the day. Please contact Lucy if you'd like to know more. So our speakers today are Dr. Toby Green and Dr. John Whittle of MyCarbon, and I will now hand over to Toby and John.
Thank you, Sally.
Thank you, Sally.
Okay, I will just nab the screen and then we'll get started. Excellent. Well, thanks very much, guys, for coming along, and thanks very much for the wonderful introduction there, Sally. Normally we do a little bit of one there. I'm not going to read that out because you've already read it. Some of you might have had the misfortune to hear my name before, or even had to attend a talk that I've done. I'm actually a qualitative researcher and a social scientist by trade, so some of you might have come across me. I was responsible working at Further, running their sort of digital offering and building that out. You might not have come across Toby though, the pleasure of Toby Green yet. But we've had some great introductions there. I'm actually going to hand across to Toby, who'll give a very brief introduction to MyCarbon, not in a salesy way, but actually because we want to explain a little bit of the context of some of this talk, so we can move on to the fascinating premise, which is obviously, you know, competitiveness through sustainability. So, Toby, do you want to give a little bit of a brief introduction to who we are?
Oh, I'd absolutely love to, John. Thank you for the handover. So MyCarbon, yeah, you might not have heard of us before. To be fair, you might not have heard of too many sustainability consultancies before. So who are we and what do we do? Well, as a sustainability consultancy, we do specialize in three key areas: calculating carbon footprints, reducing carbon footprints, and then offsetting carbon footprints. We sort of our USP is we want to take a very pragmatic approach to tackling the climate crisis. It's not about suggesting things to companies that we know are economically not feasible, aren't practical to do. So it's all about working with the clients to ensure that everything we do suggest will help them reach net zero. So we say at the last line in our slide here is that our aim is for every hour my carbon and our clients spend working together, we do produce the largest positive environmental impact possible. And then when it gets to our services in a little bit more detail, it's about greenhouse gas quantification and reporting. That's our bread and butter, okay? Because in order to reduce our footprints, which is the most important thing we need to do as a global society, we first need to measure and understand what our carbon footprint is. Otherwise, you can sort of go down a rabbit hole thinking you're doing really good, really positive work, such as maybe switching your company fleet to electric vehicles. But actually, in comparison to your wider footprint, this effect may be just absolutely negligible. So it's always about the starting point is always about understanding your footprint. Now, so this is greenhouse gas quantification reporting, but there's also another process you can do. It's called life cycle assessment. Now, a life cycle assessment is sort of that very granular approach when you're looking at the carbon footprint of a product or a service. But it still feeds into the fact that we're measuring to understand so we can help reduce. Once you're on your way to reductions, you still can mitigate your impact of the climate crisis immediately, and that's through carbon offsetting. Now, I know this doesn't have the best reputation in the general public, but actually, when it is done correctly, when the correct due diligence is there, it's a very powerful tool to fund climate projects around the world. And then there's the sort of our additional services that come into play: carbon modeling, carbon neutrality certification, third-party audits, and then actually the final one I think is really important is actually how you communicate and how you report your sustainability work. We all know that green washing is a big problem at the moment where people are overstating their claims, but you could argue that a new sort of term that called green hushing is equally just as bad. And this is where a company will do something, but they just won't talk about it. Now, why won't they talk about it? Is it a fear of coming out being called out for greenwashing, or is it the fact that they know they haven't done enough? At the end of the day, transparency is key there, and that's what we work with our clients about.
And it will make more sense why we've started with that as we move through. We'll come back to that. There's not a quiz on it, but actually giving you a brief overview of some of the biggest impact ways of sort of how we help our clients manage their impacts will actually lead directly to what we'll be talking to you about. So let's move on actually to the very direct point, which is about you guys as micro businesses and SMEs. We've got some good news, we've got some bad news, and some more mixed news. The good news is, let's be really brutally honest, as individuals, as micro businesses, your impact is minimal. You know this already. That's not going to be a surprise or a shocker to anyone, okay? Your sort of emissions account for a very little amount. However, there are, at the last estimate, 5.6 million SMEs in the UK. Now, if each SME has an average footprint of about 50 tonnes of CO2 a year, that's 280 million tonnes of CO2 going into the atmosphere. So individually, not an issue, but actually en masse, it represents quite a sizable chunk of the UK's and even the larger global emissions. So there is often an apathy we find, which a lot of big players are counting on. We always get quite frustrated when we feel that individuals are targeted. Use your reusable shopping bags. There's only so much you can do there. We get quite annoyed about that because there are a lot of the big players are still dragging their heels, as we've seen at COP27, as we've seen from governments not putting in effective legislation or holding to targets, which we'll talk about later. The way that we can actually begin to hold these larger companies and even these larger governments accountable is by doing our bit. And the more SMEs that band together, the more SMEs that actually sort out their footprint and their element of impact, the more pressure that is put sort of in the upper echelons, as it were. Now, we'll focus very quickly on what your emissions might be. Again, I'm sure all of you will know this, and this isn't the main premise of our actual talk. But in terms of, what you will be responsible for emitting. It is your travel, with your car. It will be the energy that you are using in your houses or your offices, and it might be any client or participant travel. So if you are going to a workshop or a facilities, you are interviewing people, if your clients are doing the same, then those are going to be emissions sort of attributed to the work that you are doing. If you want to change that, again, as I'm sure many of you can already understand and anticipate, you can use things like public transport. You can use incentivized travel. So if you are doing work in urban centres, you can incentivize participants to use public transport. You can use longer times between workshops to account for that. You can make sure that you are sort of enabling people to make the right decisions with what they do. Again, trying to cut down on paper, using things in a more digital way, and ultimately checking that you are using renewable supplies for you and your clients. That, in terms of your direct emissions, is really it in a nutshell. But that's not really what we're here to talk about, because that's kind of a bit self-explanatory, we feel. The biggest, and the reason why we sort of called this talk Micro Business Macro Impact, is the biggest impact that you will have really is on the advice, or through the advice that you give your clients. So as consultants, as insight specialists, as individuals who are responsible for leading and guiding larger organizations, the advice and conclusions you give to your clients will often now have an environmental impact. And they always have had an environmental impact, but we just haven't really considered it. Okay, I know that there are many times in my insights career when I would make a suggestion to someone around a product that they should use, or a change that they should make, or a territory they should explore. This was always done in the idea of, thinking about the business and what's going to be good for the business in terms of engaging with audiences and consumers, in terms of increasing market share or brand awareness. None of that has changed, but what has changed now is our awareness of what that means for the environment. So your biggest impact will be now in considering what advice can you give to your clients? What knowledge can you begin to bring? What questions can you ask them that will start to get these issues having more of a spotlight? So if you are working on a product and you are saying, hey, look, in order to focus on this particular demographic, or in order to increase the appetite for this product, we would suggest you use this, or we do this. Your biggest direct impact now will start to be about thinking about the materials that are used, the logistics of how that product might be shipped, the reuse or reusability of that product. And although this sounds incredibly sort of probably like another element to add in, another complex thing, you don't have to understand, as we will show, everything about it. Your way of adding competitive value to your clients will be showing that you understand the pressures that they will soon come under, which we will cover later on, and beginning to raise an awareness of this in terms of that understanding. And the challenge is going to be making profitable sort of conclusions and suggestions, but measuring that and balancing that with the environmental impact. So what this sort of leads to, and the reason why there's going to be a greater pressure to do this, is because your clients need to decarbonize. Toby, I'll hand this one over to you. You're on mute, Toby.
So when it comes to your clients, especially the sort of larger ones, they're all setting their net zero target. Well, they hopefully are setting their net zero targets, their net zero goals through the Science Based Target Initiative. Now, the Science Based Target Initiative is an initiative set up by the UN, the CDP, WWF, a few other major players like that. Their only agenda is limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. Okay, so it's and they've brought out this guidance on how different sectors reach net zero. Now, one difference between carbon neutral and net zero all comes from how you actually quantify emissions. So when we do quantify emissions, we do so in three scopes. Scope 1, which are your direct emissions. These are any emissions that arise directly on site, on location. Might be gas being combusted in a natural boiler, might be fuel in a company-owned vehicle. You have Scope 2. These are your purchased energy emissions. So what electricity are you purchasing? That's it. Now, these typically make up about 5 to 10% of your business emissions. And in order to be carbon neutral, you just have to quantify your scope 1 and 2 and offset these with any type of recognized carbon credit. Achieving net zero under SBTi guidance, we have to quantify something called scope 3. Scope 3, I call it the wonderful world of scope 3. My team of consultants disagree because that's actually where all the hard work begins. There's 15 different categories in scope 3, and we look at your entire value chain. Okay, so it's all the purchased goods and services, your business travel, employee commuting, and all the downstream effects of your products. You know, if you're Apple, you're making these wonderful iPhones, you actually have to take into account someone charging this iPhone every night for X many years. Okay. Now, under net zero, it's all about how we reduce this to an absolute minimum by about 90% by your target year, and then you have to offset these through carbon removals, and that's how you get that net effect. Now, for these large companies, that purchase goods and services is generally the main category, which is where the likes of research agencies are going to fall into. In order for these large companies, and ideally your clients, they need to decarbonize their supply chain. Okay, so it's going to be on you to actually make these net zero reductions, net zero targets alongside your clients, because they're not going to be able to hit their targets that they've publicly disclosed unless their whole supply chain does it with them. So that's one of the key things. And sort of the next bit is that actually how your clients actually quantify their emissions. At the moment, they'll just have your invoice, okay, and they'll call it research agency. And at the moment, we just have to apply quite a generic, quite inaccurate emission factor against this and really estimate the emissions of your services. If you know your emissions and you know what your footprint is per pound of your cost, that's incredibly valuable information for your clients. Incredibly valuable. It will help them get a more accurate carbon footprint, and it will also then help them on how to decarbonize that.
The challenge as well is that many clients don't actually even understand that this is something that they're going to have to do or that they should do. And this is where we start to begin to talk about the value you provide as consultants, as independent agents. The government has set a target of 2050. And what that means is everyone is within that. And in the next decade or so, there's going to be some quite intense legislation that's going to come in. We will probably look to be adopting similar things like Denmark have, where you are taxed on emissions. We are already working with very large clients who are starting to look at their supply chain and making very critical decisions around who they will or who they won't work with. Now, those are the clients who are already sort of ahead of the game. There are, as I've said, many clients who don't even understand that this is coming. And when they do understand and they do have to get things together, it's going to be a little bit of a rush. So how do you add competitive value? Well, it is through beginning to understand this context, understand where you sit within that supply chain, understanding the process, and understanding actually why we need to do this. So we kind of almost at this point take it a step back as well. We like to, and we use this slide, apologies for the slightly colourful language, we like to say the climate crisis doesn't care about the language you use, it cares about the action you take. We use this slide a lot with our clients. It has a very nice breakdown of actually where we are. Many of you will probably actually be looking at this and seeing this 1.5 number, which has come about. We tend to use this as an explanation, which is the IPC has done an assessment of all the current climate data, so across many different countries, many different teams, and they have assessed we need to limit the global surface temperature rising across the world to 1.5 degrees. Now, we're currently at 1 to 1.2. Many of you will have noticed this summer many of the impacts of freak weather events. We see it all the time in Australia. We see it increasingly, in the south of the UK. I never thought many of us would see parts of the motorway on fire. We are starting to see more impacts, more effects of what is happening from increased surface temperature. And this is because since what we call pre-industrial levels, we have burnt more fossil fuels. We have released more gases into the air, which have prevented heat from leaving, which has allowed the sun to continue to heat the planet and heat the oceans and start to boil fishes, start to denature forests, and start to contribute to the fact that there are more extreme weather events which are happening in places where they would never have happened before. Now, The IPC has said that we need to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. Right now, with all the targets that are in place, and we're not even saying we're hitting those, but if we were to hit all the targets that are in place, we would hit 3 degrees, and we're at 1.2. So can you imagine what happens to the planet if we double that temperature? It's not good. It's really not good. The rather sort of glib slide there, number 6, is, there's more floods, fires, and death. It's pretty much the end of days at that point. And as I've said, and as I said in the previous slide, many clients aren't even aware of what they need to do and what the UK government is already pressuring people to do, albeit in a bit of a wishy-washy way. So we talk about this 1.5 limit because it is really important. It's actually very likely that by 2050 we will have overshot 1.5. Current thinking now is that we will overshoot it and we will have to do our best to bring it back down beneath 1.5. So this is kind of the race. This is the pressure. This slide, this little conversational piece here, this is what we talk to a lot of our clients about at the start of our projects. That's the science. That's the sort of real what's going to happen. That translates into what clients need to do to actually begin to decarbonize. So the sort of biggest impact things that they need to do, which Toby has already covered, are these 3 steps. Toby, do you want to give a very quick rundown again of where they are?
Yeah, absolutely. That's it. So again, we start with the calculation. So that's measuring your carbon footprint. Okay, this is so we can understand it. Now, whether you're working with us, you're working with someone else, you're trying to do it on your own, you need to understand the 5 key principles of doing this: transparency, relevancy, accuracy, completeness, and consistency. These are the 5 key principles of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and ISO 14064 Part 1. And what that means is, if you get a report back from a consultant, it needs to be transparent. This can't be a black box exercise. Okay, so you need to ensure that you are able to have full visibility of how your carbon footprint was calculated, what emission factors they used to do this quantification, and have they been correctly referenced. Okay, you want to be able to see that full methodology. Never accept just a number back, because just a number back is pretty darn useless. Okay, this carbon footprint makes up that reduction report. Okay, so when it comes to the reduction, fair enough. If you're a micro business, some SMEs, you might not need a full net zero strategy. Okay, so when it comes to the calculation process, as standard, we will always do a hotspot analysis into your key areas and always give you a high level areas of reductions to focus on. Okay, because often that is good enough. Okay, especially if you're a smaller business. And then it comes to the offsetting piece. Now, again, you need to do your due diligence when it comes to offsetting. Okay, don't just accept what someone is trying to sell you. Okay, if you're on Ryanair's website and they want you to offset your flights, don't just click that button. Okay, because you really don't know what it's going towards. You don't know where the flow of money is. Okay, so this is when it comes to offsetting, we especially, we don't stock any of our own carbon credits. Okay, it's all about putting the education into your hands. Okay, so you understand the process, you understand the different price points of different credits, and actually how the process works. There are people out there who are buying credits for £1 and selling them for 10. Okay, that means that company, they're keeping £9 of your £10 that you wanted to go to climate action. Now, to me, that's not right. That's unethical. So really be sure, if you do decide to do offsetting, fantastic, but just make sure you do your due diligence on it.
So to sort of tie this all together, we've got a couple of bits and pieces. We've got you guys as micro businesses, as consultants, as SMEs. We've got how do we give you competitive value? We've got your clients who are going to be under increasing pressure, who need to sort out their supply chain. There's a lack of education and awareness, and there's your impact that you can have through the work that you do with them. So what does all this actually mean? How do we bring it all together? Well, we kind of put this for you guys into 4 steps, which is know your own impact. So we've already covered what you can do. Someone will come to you at some point as part of your work with them and ask you for some figures. Okay. Now, you don't have to be first in this at all. Particularly, we're facing a very deep recession at this point. This is extra work on top. none of us are suggesting this is something you should run out the door and do, and this is what we do for a living. But in the conversations we're having with clients or consultants of a similar level to yourselves, is we are going, towards the end of 2023, it would be a good idea to start planning to have some of this in order in however you do that. Be that if you've tried to take it on your own, or if you try and work with a group who will try and help you. You will at some point be required to deliver this information. So knowing your own impact, really important. And what that then translates to is, as I say, is your clients are going to be looking to you as consultants, as people who are advising them to understand the pressure they're under, all of you, when you go into any piece of work with your clients, will be doing your research on the problems and challenges they are facing. There is no bigger one at this point than the climate impact. There will be no bigger one than huge legislation that's going to come in. So if you have already done this process and you already have an understanding of what some of the calculation process might be like, you again have value because they'll come to you, they'll be talking about this, and you'll be able to share your experiences with them. Yes, it will be on a larger scale, but actually often the steps that are involved are very consistent. This speaks to that third point of staying relevant. It's also a case of, if you've gone through this and you're aware of what's happening with the environment, you're aware of what's happening with the fact that how they're going to have to consider where products are sourced from, where manufacturing takes place, how shipping happens. How does your client that you're working with match up against the competitors? There's lots of websites out there actually that offer a really good breakdown or a ranking of what current businesses are doing, and give them a score. So actually, it's quite easy to go out if you're doing a little bit of competitor landscape and have a look and go, well, actually, our client's maybe doing this, but another client's doing really well at this, or they made this mistake. They said this and they made this claim and this was wrong. It's very easy to do that sort of work, and it's becoming more and more frequent. You also, if you are ever advising on marketing communications, you need to make sure you've done your due diligence in terms of the claims that they are making sure that they're not overinstating them or that they're not hushing them away. Now, as I sort of say about this, you don't need to be an expert on this. That's obviously what our job is. But the best thing that you guys can do is be aware of the general context and know some of the questions to ask. So this is where that fourth point comes in on the educate and thrive. We've spoken about some of these steps. These are really sustainability basics. These are the things that you need to be aware of for your clients to be having the biggest impact. These are the situations and context that you just need to have knocking around in your brain. Now, if you want to go a little bit of a step further, you can start to throw around a little bit of a different language. So, if you're working with a client and they are looking at expanding their brand, they are looking at going to a new territory, or they are looking at maybe moving a process to a different country, that might impact their emissions. It might impact their baseline. It might impact their calculations. We're just working with a really large client who decided to ship all of their manufacturing from the UK in the last 5 years across to Eastern Europe, which I'm sure the consultants who worked with them at the time thought was a great idea. The problem now is all of the savings that they had from doing that, they're now having to pay back because actually the emission standards are worse. The building that they created is really tall, and actually the food they process has to be kept at a certain temperature. So they're now spending more money heating dead air, and they're just burning through money, and they're going to have to pay for those emissions at the same place. The products that they've got are actually using more intensive processes, which have a larger emission factor, which means there's more money that has to be spent on combating that. Whereas before we could make these sort of, and I often did, when I worked with clients, make these recommendations on what was just good for the business in the short term, there is the added element now of thinking about the long-term environmental and business impact that will happen. And as I said in the last point here, if it's a new product or an update to one, you don't have to necessarily know what materials they're using, but if you are suggesting something in new product development or something maybe to do with a user or consumer journey, you need to start being able to pose to your client, have they considered an assessment of cradle to gate, from cradle to grave? So from the beginning of a product or a journey's life cycle to the end, how will that play into the projections they've got? How will that play into the environmental impact? And I'll hand over to Toby just for the last sum up slide there.
Yeah, so essentially its conclusion is that 5.6 million SMEs individually, yes, you do have a micro impact on the climate crisis. Say if your average footprint is 50 tons, but together and what you do with your clients, you can have that macro impact. Legislation will be coming. Do you want to be rushing? Do you want to be scrambling, or do you want to get ahead of the game? If we look at the tender processes, The UK government, if you're bidding on a process on a project worth over 5 million, you already need to have your carbon footprint and a reduction strategy in place. Now, this is the sort of advice we're recommending to our larger clients. When you're bringing in new suppliers, they need to have this understood. So again, it's about being ahead of that curve, not scrambling to be it. You don't need to be first, but sure as hell don't want to be last.
And that's it. Thank you very much for listening. If you've got any questions about any of this, about how this might affect or relate to you, we'll happily take them now.
Yeah, thank you very much.
That was fantastic and really interesting. Thank you very much, Toby and John. I can't see any questions that have come through. Has anybody got a burning question they want to ask immediately, or otherwise I have a couple of questions I'd like to ask. No? Okay, so you were talking about doing your due diligence on finding a carbon offsetter. What do we need to look out for? What are the where do we go to find an organisation that really is bona fide and is going to be using any money that we pay them, for good cause, as opposed to taking the £9 out of 10 that you were talking about that some unscrupulous offsetters do?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So one great resource that I can recommend is that My Carbon alongside the EAUC, who's the sustainability body for universities. We co-founded something called the Carbon Coalition. So on the EAUC's website, eauc.co.uk/carbon coalition, we have open source all of our advisory pieces that we're recommending to UK universities. So it's education on what carbon credits are, it's education on what sort you should be looking for, and there's also the COP26 briefing paper we put in for that. So if anyone sort of wants to have a look at that, can't remember the web address, please contact me and I can forward it on. You also have, again, it's open source and it's from Oxford University. It's called the Oxford Offsetting Principles. A great document, again, where you can just help and learn about the carbon offsetting process and how it should be done. And then in terms of when it comes to purchasing, I'd avoid working with people who have their own credits, so traders and brokers, okay, because these are the ones that are going to keep margins. If you can, work with project developers, okay, work directly with project developers. And so that's how we do it. So we'll always try and understand what your needs are, and then we'll take that, we'll go to a project developer. We always let you know who we've purchased them from, how much we've purchased them for, and then we just add on a service fee, very small, to say this is our time for facilitating this. There's also like registries involved and there's a bit of paperwork. But yeah, try and get as close to the source as possible, because these carbon credits, they're tradable commodities. So I can purchase a carbon credit, I can keep it, I can sell it on, they can sell it. And so if I bought from a project developer for £1, I can sell it to someone else for £3, they can sell it for £5. And that's how the prices just sort of rise, whereas actually the credit was very cheap to begin with. And so if you work closer with a project developer, you can sort of be more certain that your funds are reaching that climate action.
Okay, I think we've got one question from Claire. Currently, companies claim all sorts of green credentials. If they were genuinely doing what they say, we wouldn't have a climate crisis. How do we address this issue with clients? I guess that's greenwashing, is it?
That's greenwashing. Yeah, we talk about this a lot, as you can imagine, and we do a lot of work with clients in terms of helping them write effective comms. There is a desire, because of the need to try and differentiate yourself in a very busy consumer market. There is a desire to make claims that will make you stand out, and we have seen a lot. I think we've seen more of that than we have of people actually making accurate claims, because up until now, really, there haven't been consequences. There hasn't been legislation, and the most that has happened is there's been a little bit of upset. We are seeing an increasing amount of awareness from individuals, from groups, and slowly, oh so slowly, from governments. Now, the problem is that, even governments themselves are guilty of doing this. And I think that the prevailing sentiment many of us had in the sector after COP27 closed last week was it's probably more on the industry than ever to actually manage this rather than relying on governments and companies. It's more on us to hold them to account. When we talk with our clients about this, we often say to them, look, at the minute, if you are found out about this, the consequences might be minor. However, what is going to happen again when this legislation that we're already looking at starts to come in is that if you have a history of making spurious claims or making claims that are not well founded, when we get down the line and actually there starts to become an element where this is taxed and it is a liable asset, there is going to be more scrutiny upon you. It's very much a case of acting correctly in the short term so you're better situated for the long term. And there will be, increasingly now, particularly with younger generations, we are seeing they are more likely to lead with their feet, to lead with their money. And there we have found in many companies who haven't done the correct work, the correct reporting publicly, that they are losing a share of younger consumers who are obviously the ones who are eventually going to probably move into spending the most in the economy. So it's very much about talking about the future. I would also probably just raise examples recently of people who've done it really badly. I mean, the BBC, I'm sure many of us have seen, been talking about the World Cup. The World Cup has, been responsible for creating, I think it's, what was it, Toby, 3 times the amount of reported impact it was supposed to. And rather than using it as a great platform, they've really screwed that up, in my opinion. So I think we always say when we talk with our clients, it's about having a quarter shame and 3/4 pride. So it's a little bit of don't be like this, don't make the mistakes of these companies, and then be proud of what you're doing and build on it. If you take the right steps, you can make small claims to begin with that actually very quickly exponentially grow into really large, credible, fantastic claims. If you check out a post that we shared on LinkedIn today, actually, we worked with a rum company called Two Drifters Distillery. Fantastic work they've done in sort of creating a product that has a very minimal environmental impact and is really effective. And they found actually that is a really unique USP. So celebrating the wins, probably putting a spotlight on the more challenging effects as well.
Okay, thank you. So Sylvia's asked a question as well. You mentioned that as micro businesses, our direct carbon emissions are rather small. Is there an estimated calculation of the amount for us to have as a reference?
That's a really tricky question. We get this from every single client, especially when we give them the carbon footprint. They're like, "Is this big?" It's all relative. It's all relative to you. Every business is very different and unique. You can have a company of 50 people all working from home, just office based, just doing desk based research. You can have a business of 3 people who are actually shipping in loads of goods from China, getting them air freighted, and then air delivering them across the UK. So a team of 50 could have a much smaller impact than a team of 3 in that sort of example. In our sort of slides, we said an SME might have an average footprint of about 50 tons. I mean, it really depends on who you are. If you're just a one-man band working at home, I'd be surprised if your footprint is above 10 tons a year. For reference, as an UK individual, you're about 12 to 14 tons. If you're a slightly larger company, but if you're not doing any traveling, you're still office based. If you're not manufacturing, you're going to struggle to exceed 100 tons. Okay, it's when you start flying, it's when you start manufacturing or purchasing a load of goods for resale, that's when your emissions will get larger and larger. At home or just in an office, just doing desk-based research, your emissions aren't going to be massive. So that's why we're trying to stress it's the other side, what you're recommending. That's where the real impact is.
There isn't a sort of template or something that we can, an easy calculation that can be done by micro businesses, because all of the people working at the ICG we're less than 3 employees, and most of us have sort of home offices, I suspect. So it would be really useful to have some sort of an idea, a template that would give us an idea of how much our carbon footprint might be. What the key thing? I imagine mostly it's probably the energy we use in keeping warm in our home offices, and then potentially some travel. But then most of us do a lot of online research these days, so we're not actually traveling around very much either. So is there a way of calculating that very simply?
Yeah, there are some online, see, there are some online tools available. However, this goes back to I sort of refer back to the key principles of calculating, the transparency aspect. These calculators online, they're a black box. You'll enter your numbers, you'll get a number out, and you just be like, oh, okay, there's nothing more you can do with it. So by actually either doing the numbers yourselves, working with someone, and actually understanding where the numbers come from, understanding different levels of impact from the different activities, that's where change can happen. If I just gave to you a result on a screen and said 10 tons, what are you going to do with that information? So it is a bit of a challenge. We can get together and help put together a template or something for ICG members. So it could just be like an Excel tool where, again, they can understand their numbers and their impact. But yeah, on online tools, I'd just be wary of, and that's not to try and validate my own service, my own job. It's just so you're aware that a black box isn't the right answer.
To provide a comparison that I use quite a lot when still talking to a lot of colleagues in the insights industry, is it's the difference from when you're talking to a client. Many clients could go and use self-service research tools, and there are some fantastic ones out there, but I think we're all aware of the value of an individual who can actually provide expertise on what you are doing. That's by the very nature of the ICG is very much what it's founded on, is the value of the individual in providing more than just a number. A lot of these calculators, and bearing in mind, we're supposed to be taking very critical decisions based on the outputs of these calculators. Yeah, we're supposed to be influencing our lifestyles. We're supposed to be making a change to the environment. As Toby says, a lot of them, you can't ever figure out how they came to the number. The way that we work when we work with any client is we always like to deliver to you not just your calculations, but also the workings as it was. So someone else could go and actually prove that. We're academics by trade, and we believe very much in the peer review process. That features into how we actually deliver our work. We've taken over many other projects from previous consultants who have just delivered reports to people, and we've then had to go in and try and unpick them. And because this is still a young industry, and because a lot of assumptions still have to be made sometimes, it's all about, as I've said before when I was a researcher, if you put bad data in, you get bad insight out. So although there are some self-service tools, often it is very key, particularly at this stage. Maybe in 10 years' time, when this industry is more fully formed, there is more regulation, it will be a lot easier, with more education to do all of this. But for the time being, we very much recommend, working with someone who can walk you through this. And again, educate you so that down the line, you might be able to take more on yourself.
Okay, that's great. Are there any particular standards that you stick to in terms of, if we were to go to our clients and say, look, we've done this calculation, this is what our carbon footprint is, that something that actually certifies that the information you've given us, that your black box actually is legitimate and is valid? Is there any way of doing that, or either you or anybody else that we turn to for that sort of information?
Yeah, there is. So the standards that you want to have a look at are the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and ISO 14064 Part 1. Now, so they're the standards on quantification. And it's always recommended that then if you want to go for carbon neutrality, okay, there's a standard called from the BSI, British Standards Institute, called PAS 2060, PAS 2060. And now this is sort of a standard on how you achieve carbon neutrality. So ensuring that the carbon footprint has been done in the correct way and the offsets have been done in the correct way as well. Now we'd provide something called a QES statement. It's pretty much just a long, boring document, which is just a checklist to say what's done. Now, then you have two options. So you've got open source validation, or you've got third-party verification. We always recommend open source. One, because it's free. It just means you have to publicly display your carbon footprint report and the QES statement, or you can get someone else to verification. Now, we don't like that because one, it's probably going to be more expensive than it's cost us to do your report and the PAS 2060. And two, you've done great work, showcase it.
Okay. Okay. Are there any other questions from anybody? Couple of questions. So one from Andrew. Given that most of us work from home, surely it's more of a challenge to separate the impact of our work and the impact of our households in general, or other people who live with us. Yeah, that's a good point.
Sure. Yeah, there's actually a number of different methodologies we can use to calculate emissions from home working. So that's not really too difficult of an issue when it comes to the quantification. It's quite standard now, especially after COVID, everyone's working from home.
Okay. And then another question from Claire. What is the correct terminology? There seems to be lots of different words, green, ethical, ESG, sustainable, and many others, used by different organizations. Which is the correct terminology to use?
Okay, great question. Oh,
Sure, we go, Toby.
yeah, great question. The only two terms you need to look out for are carbon neutral and net zero. Things such as eco-friendly, climate positive, they don't mean anything. That's just something that's been put forward. John and I were looking at some Christmas presents for our team. We're searching sustainable hampers, things like that. And there was loads of content out, loads of sustainable hampers, all wrapped up in plastic. And we were like, what's sustainable about this other than the fact you've just put the word sustainable in front of this gift? There was no life cycle assessment. There was just absolutely nothing. You can say eco-friendly. What does that mean? So the only two terms you really need to look out for are carbon neutral and net zero.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Any more questions? No, I think that's it. Thank you very much indeed, Toby and John, for talking to us about net zero and carbon neutrality. So I'm sure it's given us lots of food for thought. And thank you to everybody today for logging in. Really good to see you. Do join us for our last webinar of the year in 2 weeks' time on cyber security. And other than that, thanks very much and have a good afternoon, everyone. Bye-bye, all.
Any questions?
Thank you, everyone.
All right, take care.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
Bye. Bye.